So when Nicole and I were newlyweds, in fact, just a week after our wedding day, I remember us talking about how we were just overwhelmed by all the generous gifts we got from people on our wedding. And I remember us checking our bank account and being like, we have $800 extra in our checking account. What are we gonna do with that? And savings wasn't really a great option for us. We wanted to spend it, of course. And so we had always wanted one of those new high-def TVs that were out, the flat screen ones. And we thought, man, let's use some wedding money and go out and purchase a high-def TV for ourselves. And so we were all excited. We go to the store, we pick it up, and I remember as we were driving to the store, the clouds started to form in the sky, just like they always do in the springtime here in North Texas. They were like grayish, greenish, ominous clouds that you knew a thunderstorm was around the corner. As we're checking out, it starts to rain a little bit. We get the TV home and up the 3 flights of stairs to our 3rd-story apartment. I remember just as we were getting in the apartment, it starts raining cats and dogs, and the wind is so heavy. It's like raining sideways, and there's thunder, and there's lightning. It's a full-on Texas thunderstorm. Now, I was all excited about the TV, and I started cutting the box open and getting the TV out, and Nicole was like, hey, Gavin, turn on the weather. Now, you have to remember, this was right before apps on smartphones existed, so there was no other way to check the weather than to tune into the TV or to go online on your computer. And so the TV was the main way that we could check the weather, and she wanted to turn the weather on and see what was coming. And I said, honey, it's a thunderstorm. We've been through 1,000 of these. Let's just get our new TV set up. So she was frustrated and I was impatient. I couldn't wait for this storm to pass before I hooked up my new TV. I said, it's just gonna take a couple seconds. I'll unhook the old one and hook the new one right up. And of course, since it was a new, digital TV, it had to search for those hundreds of channels that don't really exist, and it searched forever. And right as I got the new TV, set up and it was searching and was just finishing that process, the tornado sirens went off outside, which means a tornado had touched down in our city. And Nicole just rolls her eyes, picks up our dog, and walks to the bathroom and sits in the bathroom tub, which is our safe spot during a storm. And I start walking towards her, and I'll never forget, I'm thinking, gosh, why didn't I just wait and watch the weather so we could have gotten safe first? We could have gotten to a better location than our 3rd-story apartment. And I remember walking after her, and then I had that thought pop in my mind. The nicest thing I've ever owned is right behind me. So I peek back over my shoulder and I see this TV looking at me like, are you just gonna leave me here if a tornado comes? So I turn around and I unplug the TV and I pick it up and I take it with me and I set it down in the tub with us. So it's Nicole and me and our dog and our new TV as we wait out the storm. I think we've all been in moments like this in our lives where our impatience gets the best of us. In fact, I believe in our culture and in our lives, we struggle to wait, but what we learn about John chapter 7 and the chapters that follow is that waiting on the Lord is actually one of the keys to the Christian faith. So the first 2 verses of John chapter 7 have some really important details in them. First of all, Jesus has been doing ministry outside of Judea, out in the region called Galilee, up to the north, for probably about 6 months. In fact, last we see him is when he performs that big miracle of feeding the multitude at Passover. Passover happens in the spring, and now today we're gonna read in verse 2 that he's performing this next interaction with the people down in Jerusalem at another feast called the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Shelters. This would have been one of 3 feasts that all of Israel was commanded and expected to go into Jerusalem to celebrate together, Passover being one of them. And so Jesus kind of stays outside of Jerusalem for 6 months because the tension in his ministry is building. The Jewish leaders, they want to kill him, and they're opposed to him, and they're threatened by him, but also the people of Israel and the surrounding area, they're overwhelmed by this Jewish rabbi. He's saying things that are provocative, he's healing people, and his following is increasing. And so everyone has an opinion of Jesus. So Jesus decides as privately as possible to go into Jerusalem and celebrate this feast along with the rest of Israel. Now, I want to talk just a bit about this feast. It would have been really one of the most joyous celebrations in the Jewish calendar. It was a harvest festival for the ages. Every fall, as the harvest begins to come in, Israel takes a full 7 days out of their calendar to stop and remember that God is their provider and to remember the years in which they wandered in the desert. This is what the Feast of the Booths is all about. So there's really 2 big ideas with the Feast of the Booths. The word that means booths or shelters is the word sukkah. The Hebrew word sukkah literally just would translate for us like tent. It's a temporary dwelling that you set up and live in. So every year there would be a time in the Jewish calendar to stop and for a week to celebrate the Festival of the Booths. Now this term sukkah, like I talked about, it means tent, and Jews would literally, and even to this day still do, they set up and live in this tent for a full 7 days. And there's really 2 big ideas behind it. they want to interrupt their routine and remember two key things. The first one would be that God provides the harvest. In fact, part of the tradition for this came out of the idea that many farmers would go out into the fields to work, and they would be so busy with the work of the harvest that they didn't even have time to go into their homes at night. So they would set up a temporary dwelling like a tent, and they would live there during the harvest. The second big idea, though, is that like the Passover and what Jesus had to say at Passover, Israel remembered what God did in bringing them out of Egypt and providing for them for the 40 years they wandered in the desert before they entered the Promised Land. And in that portable span of a generation, these people lived in tents. They were nomads waiting to find their chosen land. And God provided for them miraculously every day, like we talked about with the bread last week. And so Israel would pause, and in this festival, they would remember God brings the harvest, but also God provided for us in the desert. He brought us into this land. If it wasn't for Him, we wouldn't have a land of our own to begin with. And so they would remember those years that they celebrated and worshiped God in a big tent called the tabernacle. And it was during this time that they would live in a tent, in a sukkah, to remember the good that God has already done and celebrate God as their provider. Now, Jesus chooses this setting to say two really key statements. I want to read the first one for you in John chapter 7, starting in verse 37. On the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." Now this he said about the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive. For as yet the Spirit had not been given because Jesus was not yet glorified. Now every single day during this feast of the shelters, the high priest would actually go and draw some water and bring it in, and in the temple, he'd pour the water along with some wine into a basin. And every day there was a great procession and a great crowd would follow him, and they would celebrate and cheer, and they'd remember how God brought forth water from the rock for Israel. But on the last day, the 8th day, as the ceremonies were coming to a close, there would be no procession of drawing the water. And it was on that day that Jesus stood up and said, if any of you are thirsty, because we haven't done that water rite today, we haven't done that processional and celebrated God's provision of water. If any of you thirst, you should come to me because I have a source of water that you don't know about. It was on that day that he stood up and told all of Israel, look, I am the water you're longing for. I am the provision and the sustenance you need. But then he says something really remarkable also in chapter 8 that would tie back into the book of Exodus. In verse 12, it says, again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Now, this event takes place the next morning, the day after the festival comes to a close. And all throughout this festival, the people would celebrate in the temple courts joyously all day. And at night, in the treasury room of the temple, they would light a great lampstand. And that lampstand would actually give enough light to the entire temple, and one of the priests would light it. And many people from around the community would come and bring small torches of their own, and they would light it off of the lampstand, and they would celebrate and sing praises to God and talk about God's provision and His guidance of Israel through a pillar of fire as they wandered in the desert. In fact, God would show Himself in Exodus faithful. Even as the people were unfaithful, He showed them the way to the Promised Land by providing a great light in the sky, a pillar of fire every single day. And the people during this week, the long festival, they would celebrate that God had guided them to their Promised Land. So Jesus is essentially standing up in this local synagogue and saying, I am your light, just like God was in the pillar of fire for all of Israel. And I'm guiding you somewhere. I'm taking you on a mission, and one day I'm gonna lead you into your Promised Land, which is eternity in heaven. In fact, one thing that's really clear in John chapter 7 is that Jesus was very aware that He does not belong of this world. He's come here for a very specific purpose. And that purpose is to tell all of us that He's here to set us free from our captivity to sin. We talked about that in John chapter 6, the idea that Jesus is saying that He is the bread of life, just like God provided bread for Israel at Passover. Here in chapter 7, He says, I am eternal water. You're thirsty and you're wanting God to provide water like He did from the rock in Israel's day, and I'm here to provide you eternal water. And now He's saying, I am your light and your guide, just like God was the guide for all of Israel. So I believe Jesus purposely chooses this festival to announce to us, His followers, that we're temporary residents here. In fact, we're supposed to be actively waiting on the Lord. And that active waiting is not just waiting for God to answer a prayer. It's not just waiting on the Lord's timing, which is very important. But more importantly, it's waiting on the Lord's return. And as we wait on His return, nothing else should matter like His second coming. And as we wait, we, like Jesus in the world, we should be living on mission for Him. In fact, you and I, we're called to build a sukkah and take up residence in it like Israel would during the week of that festival. We should view this world as a tent that we live in, a temporary dwelling. And during this week, when you look at our lives in light of eternity, during this 7 days, we live in this sukkah. But you and I, we get so caught up in the stuff of this world, the roots that we want to set down, the comforts that we build, the shallow permanence that this place can create for us. And yet our souls know that there's something more than this place. You and I are called to live in a sukkah here and now. Like the farmers who went out into the field, and they don't even have time to go back to their homes because the harvest is at hand, so they live in this temporary dwelling. Like all of Israel as they wander the desert, awaiting for God to lead them into the promised land, you and I, we have work to do, a mission to live out, a harvest to reap until Jesus comes again and takes us home. That is what He is trying to call us to here, that we're supposed to live in the sukkah. And so what I challenged our group with this week is, how can you live aware of and in tune with the harvest that Jesus has called you to? How can we shift our perspective away from the comforts of this world and into this missional, temporary living that we're called to? Maybe we all just need to build a tent or go camping for a week. But we need to live on mission for Jesus, reaching others and realizing that He will sustain us with His water and He will guide us by His light each new day if you and I would just learn to live by His Spirit and live under His tent.